waiting for the live stream. Okay, good. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second Edinburgh Publishing Conference, Disruption in the Publishing Industry, Digital Analytics and the Future. My name is Jo Young. I run the Scientific Editing Company, and along with three other organisers, Graham Steele, Rachel Blomer and Jan Westminster, who you'll see running around, we brought together the idea of the Publishing Conference while sitting in the pub a couple of years ago. Ran it last year in June, roughly the same time. It was really successful, so we decided to run the sequel this year. So we hope that you're really going to enjoy today. I think everyone should have their badges. You should also be able to have wireless. If you don't have access to the wireless, pop out to the registration desk and we'll set it up for you. We've got 4 sessions today. Each of them are about an hour and a half long, and they're punctuated by coffee breaks and lunch, and ending with a drinks reception this evening as well. So I hope you enjoy the day, and I'm now just going to pass over to Graham Steele after 1 or 2 housekeeping things. There are no fire alarms planned today, so if you do hear the fire alarm, you really can't miss it. If you could just make your way out of either the exit at the back or the exit down here at the front, down the stairs and out onto the Clue Place, which is the street that you came in on at reception, then please do that quite quickly. Toilets, if you come out of the auditorium corridor, turn around to your left and go through the double doors. The toilets are around there, both the ladies and the gents. Any questions, do please ask myself or anyone at registration, and we'll be happy to help you out. But now I would just like to move swiftly on and hand over to Graham Steele, who will be chairing Access Open Publishing in a Digital World.
Merci. Okay, thanks everybody for coming to sunny Scotland. Took a wee while to get that sorted out for you, but anyway. I want to read through the full introductions to the speakers. You've got that information online or on your programmes, but essentially the first speaker is currently known as the Managing Director of Digital Science. I would probably say he's probably best known for the time that he spent at NPG, National Portrait Gallery? No, Nature Publishing Group, as the Managing Director of Nature.com, essentially bringing Nature, a paper to an online format. Other than that, he's also involved with Timo Riley, Chris DeBona, as co-organisers of Science FUCAN. So that's a very big introduction to Timo Hannay.
I can't see that clock from here, so someone's going to have to help you. Oh, actually, no, there's one. Okay, give me the slip photo so we're not going too long. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks so much for inviting me and for that introduction. It's a real delight to be here, especially come back to my ancestral homeland. Hannay's come from Edinburgh, but as you can tell from my accent, I don't. But it's a real pleasure to be here. I want to talk about the relationship between publishers and scientists. I've worked in publishing for many years now, as Graham alluded to. But I was originally a scientist. I was a research neurophysiologist, and I still feel myself emotionally and intellectually a scientist, even if I'm probably kidding myself, because I haven't been in the laboratory for about 20 years now. The title of my talk is Publishers, Saviours of Science. Those of you who aren't familiar with me may think I'm being slightly facetious. Those of you who are familiar with me will know that I'm being completely facetious. But I do want to make a somewhat serious point about how publishers, I think, can improve their relationships with scientists, and more importantly, do something to really help science move forward. So the background to this is that journal publishers are frequently portrayed, with some good reason in some cases, as inhibitors of science, or at least inhibitors of scientific progress and the free flow of scientific knowledge. So you'll all be familiar with things like the cereals crisis, the rapidly increasing price of subscriptions to scientific journals, where more and more content is being published, but even allowing for that, there's clearly a problem with the increasing prices, and that was a big topic. It has been a big topic for many years. Similarly, the rise of open access, which publishers, by and large, are adopting now. I mean, you see, Springer buying Biomet Central, which is really the pioneer of author-pays open access publishing. My own colleagues at Nature, they're now one of the biggest open access publishers, both as a result of the stuff they've been doing internally, but also as a result of their partnership with Frontier, just Swiss-based open access publishing house. But you go back and you talk, so for example, with the people who set up, services like PubMed and Archive. Certainly, they would tell you that publishers are highly resistant to those kinds of services, and PubMed Central, for example, are highly resistant to those kinds of services, as well as in many cases being initially highly resistant to the idea of open access journals. Journals get criticised for other reasons. For example, elitism, particularly journals like Nature, Science, and Cell, are often criticised for being highly elitist. I can hear some noise. I don't know if okay. Some background noise. I'll try and speak up. I think again with some good reason. There was an article by Randy Shackman, a very well-known biologist, that appeared a few months ago, end of last year, criticising these journals for being too highly selective, for holding up a certain subset of science for special attention, if you like, and saying that was a wholly unhealthy thing to do. I have some sympathy for that kind of view. I do think that Randy was perhaps not best placed to make that point. I thought it was a bit ironic but this appeared in the Guardian of the title you can see, but when you actually read the piece, it sort of seems to me like it should have appeared in the Onion under the title "Elitism has no place in science," said Berkeley professor and Nobel laureate. I didn't think he was the best placed person to make that point, to be honest. I thought he missed the target, but I do have some sympathy with that view. Even more recently, certain journals are publishing content willy-nilly because it's in their commercial interest to do without any due attention to the quality or significance or indeed credibility of that scientific information. And we see as a result of that even open access publications are not immune from claims that they're being venal rather than trying to support the scientific process. But I want to make the point that it hasn't always been thus. Modern science arose with the invention of the scientific journal, of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. It was when alchemists, if you like, started publishing in journals like this that they became chemists, they became scientists, and modern science was born. As a result, the act of publishing is almost synonymous with the act of doing science, and the nature of scientific progress is the act of publishing that puts that information into the public domain, makes it part of the shared corpus of knowledge, and that kind of knowledge sharing is what created modern science from the kind of closed approach that, for example, the alchemists were taking back in the 17th century. And one of the founders of the Royal Society, over here we've got Robert Boyle, who I want to talk about a little bit. He's Anglo-Irish, he was born in Ireland, comes from a vastly wealthy family, inherited a huge estate in England, and was therefore rich enough to be able to devote his life to, among other things, doing science. And he's best known probably among school kids for Boyle's law, relationship between temperature, pressure, and volume of gases. He worked as a skeptical chemist, one of the founding documents of modern chemistry, and was arguably the first modern scientist, or certainly one of the first modern scientists. Now, he was also, like Newton, an alchemist, deeply religious, but no one's perfect. He was certainly a very significant figure in the history of science. One of the things that interests me about him is his development, if you like, of what you might term as sort of scientific best practice. And so there were some characteristics to the way he did his work. For example, he was meticulous in documenting his methods, the way he did his experiments, down to every last detail. He was also meticulous in reporting his results, including so-called failed experiments. He felt this was very important, and I agree with him. In some cases, he even conducted his experiments in front of witnesses so that he could have corroboration that that was what really happened. So by current standards, that's what he's still taking things to real extremes. But I want to come back to this later because I think this is really important in terms of establishing how science ought to be done and how it should be open and how it should be as unbiased as possible. These days in science, we have a new kind of openness. You don't have to be a bewigged aristocrat to do science anymore. Almost anyone can do it. You have to have a high level of education. But other than that, ordinary people can do it. Judging by these stock photos, you also have to be quite good looking to do it. But in essence and in principle, the profession of science is now open to anyone, which is a fantastic thing and a big step forward since the 17th century. And indeed, there have been other obvious progresses since then as well. But there are a number of really profound problems in science these days, I think. I want to touch on some of them. I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I want to touch on 3 of them. Fraud and misleading results. Lack of reproducibility,
Exactly.
Lack of reproducibility, and the information deluge in science. There are others as well. I think, for example, there's too little reward of risk-taking in science, but I'm not going to talk about that because this is a long enough list already, and also I'm a bit less clear about what publishers in particular can do to help in that area. Let's talk a little bit about fraud. The things that hit the headlines are things like Haruko Obakata, who's this Japanese lady here. I used to live in Japan for many years, and it's still my second home. I was back there in April, and this was the #1 news story for some time, until the Korean ferry sank. This was the #1 news story in Japan across all the media. It was amazing. She published, my colleagues published some papers in Nature that it seems have included some fraudulent results or some fraudulent reporting of results. And as I understand it, it's since been retracted. You also got the Korean stem cell researcher, Hwang Woo-suk, and in case anyone thinks it's just about Oriental stem cell research, you've got people like Mark Hauser at Harvard. He's an expert on cognition in animals, who was also called up for apparently fraudulent behaviour in research. And I've also got the example here of Gregor Mendel, who of course is known as the founding father of genetics, and the discoverer of the particulate nature of inheritance that explains some problems in evolutionary theory that Darwin was well aware of but didn't know the answer to. There have been claims, although they are disputed, that Gregor Mendel filled his results as well. I think, in some ways you could look at all of this and say, actually, this is actually pretty good. First of all, there's 5 to 10 billion scientists in the world. The fact that there's a few bad apples is not surprising. It would be surprising if there weren't. But the fact that they've been outed is a good thing. That's healthy. And in a way, we've made progress since the days of Mendel, or at least when he became famous and when the textbooks were written about him, because now we really do care deeply, not just about whether scientists are right or not, because Gregor Mendel is famous mainly because he's right, but we care about how they did their work, and what their approach was, and how they reached their conclusions, not just what those conclusions were. So I think that's healthy. But actually, not so fast, because I think there's in a way, deeper and more pervasive problem that actually crops up every day in science. So misleading scientific results aren't mainly about these kinds of high-profile fraud cases. They're about, I think, things like, I've tried to document here. For example, manipulation and selection of data. All scientists do it, and it's a necessary part of the scientific process. But I think we need to have a really healthy debate about when it isn't acceptable. There's a really interesting article here from a journal I don't normally read because it's not my field, The Plant Cell, which talks about image manipulation. Image manipulation in microscopy and cell biology is a very, very big topic. It's a big problem. When is it okay to crop images? Most of the time, it's probably okay. When is it okay to filter the images in order to reveal things that weren't otherwise visible? Well, most of the time, probably not okay, but you at least ought to be honest about what you've done. And then there's lots of other stuff in between where it's definitely debatable about what level of image manipulation you should go through. And this can lead to misleading results. Even more basically, when you write a paper, you choose what to put in the figures and what to display, right? You're trying to support a narrative that you've drawn out of the data, made a discovery, you want to explain that, and you want to show the data and results that explain that and demonstrate it most clearly. So you're not trying to mislead anyone, but you're trying to make the narrative and what you communicate as clear as possible. But that can lead to misleading your readers if you're not careful about it. And of course, you wouldn't want to go, so this guy clearly shouldn't be a scientist, right? But there's similar things going on when you choose what to put in your paper as opposed to not putting in your paper. And I think we need to be open and honest about that. My sense is this is much more pervasive, much less conspicuous, and therefore much more insidious, actually, than the kinds of high-profile fraud that I was just talking about a little bit earlier. And perhaps some of these practices are part of the reason, but only part of the reason for another really big problem in science that I alluded to earlier, which is lack of reproducibility. I'm not going to try to say that word now. There was a very prominent cover article in The Economist, I think last October, How Science Goes Wrong. Actually, Nature has written a lot about this as well. And there's been some really interesting work done by Professor Stanford, John AQnowledge, who talks about, well, he's done some work looking at how, what proportion of high-profile research results, particularly biology, turn out to be right. And his claim and the claim of others is that it's a very large proportion, perhaps even a majority, that turn out to be wrong. And he wrote a very interesting commentary, actually, here, which was in, I think it was in PLOS Biology, if I remember correctly. It was PLOS Medicine, wasn't it? Yeah. Thank you. Which is really interesting about, the causes of this problem of reproducibility, which are really quite deeply embedded in the scientific process, actually. Let's talk about what some of those causes are. We can't go through all of them, but some of them are to do with problems of data selection and so forth that I mentioned earlier. And some of them are to do just with the way that you have to do science and the systems you're studying, right? So as a biologist, I realised that when you do the same experiment on apparently the same cell or the same looking cell, you'll get different results, right? There's just a natural degree of variability. And you never know what the factors are that are causing all of that variability. And there could always be confounding factors that you're unaware of in your experimental design. There was a fairly well documented case recently in the last few months around some biologists that were doing the same experiment, apparently identical experiments were getting different results, and it turned out, I think, that the frequency of the mixer that they were using, or the degree with which they were agitating a certain solution, turned out to be the difference and the material difference between the experiments they were doing and the cause of the differences in their results, and no one would have predicted that ahead of time. So there's all sorts of confounding factors that can mean that one person doesn't get the same result as another. Perhaps one of the best, understood is publication bias, right? You have 20 different labs doing the same experiment. 19 of them get an unsurprising result that they therefore don't publish. One gets a surprising result that they do publish, and it turns out that it's a statistical artifact. So that's well understood, but I don't think adequately solved yet. And this is actually a point that's made in John AQnowledge's article, which is something really basic about what our criteria are for a material result. And he makes several points, and I really encourage you to read the article. It's very interesting. But one of the points he makes is the p-scores that we use don't take into account the prior probability of the hypothesis, probability of the hypothesis is correct, right? So even if you've got quite a low p-score, high probability of being statistically real, if the prior probability of that hypothesis was very low, then it's still likely that your result is misleading, right? And that's something that I certainly didn't know when I was working in the lab, and I didn't take that into account. I think most scientists probably don't. It's something we need to address. I want to address one final point, which is there's arguably too much science out there, certainly too many scientific publications. Almost any researcher you'll speak to will complain that they can't keep up with all the publications that they should be reading. And I think there's also a real problem with how consequential many publications are. So there are a couple of articles I picked out here that have written about this. And you hear various statistics, but one of the ones that was quoted in actually it's called a higher education article, if I remember correctly, was a statistic that basically about 40%, just over 40% of articles published in top science journals and social science journals were not cited at all in a 4-year period. So there's a very high proportion of articles that are not cited. That's not necessarily to say they were completely devoid of any impact, but it's certainly indicative that maybe there's too much inconsequential research being published, and it has a cost, right? It has a cost not just publishing it, but it has a cost in the sense of taking up the bandwidth of the researchers that are supposed to be filtering all this stuff in order to work out what's interesting. And I think this is only going to get worse, right? Why is it going to get worse? There's very strong pressures in the direction of publishing more, right? There is the imperative to publish. Researchers are required to do it, quite rightly so. There is an incentive to publish in minimum publishable units, right? So if you haven't done groundbreaking work, you can at least get as many publications as possible out of it. Never mind the quality, feel, or width kind of approach. I think there is a perverse incentive to do that. Author pays open access creates not uniquely, but I think in particular creates a commercial incentive for publishers to publish as much as possible, as many papers as possible. And actually, people like me say that actually we should be publishing all our results, right, including so-called negative results, which would make life even more nightmarish, okay, in terms of being able to filter this stuff. So those are sort of some areas of concern. There's fraud, or the minor version of misleading results. There's lack of reproducibility, and there's just the sheer volume of scientific information that's out there. And I think these create really profound challenges for science, and we shouldn't assume that science can just cope with them with the current approaches we're using. How do we solve these problems? I'm going to go back to Robert Boyle. I think some of the things we should be doing are capturing full experimental details at source in the lab. We should be ensuring complete transparency of all the results, including raw data files and things before you've made any manipulation or selection of the data. I think we should be fostering open, critical discussion of the literature online. And I think we should be embracing new forms of scientific communication and new forms of scientific publication. What I'm going to do now is just spend the last few minutes talking about some of the things that we're doing in digital science. Just quickly describe 3 products, not as a sort of product promotion, but as examples of how I think we can address some of these problems. I'm going to talk about 3 products. There's going to be LabGuru, Figshare, and Altmetric. There are alternatives available. I'm not trying to promote these particular products. There are many alternatives available. But it's an understatement. I think Figshare has more impersonators than Elvis. But but I'm going to talk about these products because I know these in some detail. I know the reason we set them up, and I think they relate to some of the problems that we're trying to solve. So LabGuru, very, very briefly, is a web-based application organizing all the information in the lab, right? So it will keep track of your protocols, which protocols used with which experiment, which reagents and samples used with those experiments, which data sets they generated. It works on the web through, say, your laptop or desktop machine, but it works with tablet and smartphone devices as well. You can do things like photograph, test tubes or QR codes on test tubes. You can use things like following protocols on your tablet, and it will help you keep track of multiple experiments, and then sync all of that with your online account. So this is sort of, this is your sort of electronic lab notebook, if you like. It's a little bit different from most products in that space, but it's that broadly in that space. This is the new technology-enabled way of doing what Boyle was trying to do, which is capture every last detail of the experiment he did. Okay? We don't need to write that in a notebook anymore. We can use technology to enable it and capture it at source at the lab bench. Secondly, Figshare, which I just mentioned. So Figshare is a website where you can post data sets and share them, and they're posted by individual researchers, they're posted by publishers, so we have arrangements with BOSS and Taylor Francis and Nature Publishing Group and Faculty of 1000 Research. I'm sorry for the ones I left out, but those are the ones I remember off the top of my head. And they all deposit data files associated with the papers they publish, but it's also open to anyone who would like to share data online, and it makes it citable and available and searchable. We're set up by Mark Hannay, who I think he's not here now, will be coming along later. Yeah. So you can speak with him during this event. And he wanted to share his results. He was so well as at Imperial College, he wanted to share his results, didn't have a good place to do it, so he built the website. I think this speaks to what I was talking about earlier in terms of the full dissemination of all the data behind your research. And I was trying to make clear earlier on why I think that's important. It also, I think just as importantly, links with the literature. So I said we work with publishers, where we accept data sets from them, link to those papers, and the papers link back to the data sets. Yeah? So that connection is incredibly important. When you read the paper, you need to be able to access the underlying data in order to be able to interpret it and critique it if necessary. And it also gives you the capability to be able to post documents, so you can post fuller experimental details, for example, if you want to be able to do that. And one of the things we obviously have in mind is being able to, I don't think you can do this today, is being able to just push data from applications like LabGuru directly into Figshare. You may even be able to do that today, but that's certainly something we have in mind. So you want to be able, you want to be able to collect that data and information at the bench, use that within your lab, but then at the point of publication, or even before the point of publication, formal publication, you can push that to a sharing service like Figshare and make it openly available. Finally, I'm just going to talk about altmetric. Altmetric indexes whatever content we can on the web that's talking about the scientific literature, the research literature, so social media, blogs, Twitter, Facebook, Google+, all of those kinds of things. Mainstream media, CNN, BBC, New York Times, but also non-English language companies, among those kinds of things. These days, government policy documents as well. We want to look at the sort of political and policy impact of research, and we'll be doing things in future like patents. So we're trying to sort of index and scan the web and trying to understand what attention is being paid to the research literature, and in particular to which articles. And that gets distilled into a number which gives you an idea of the amount of attention being paid to it. It doesn't tell you whether it's a high quality paper or not, it just tells you how much attention is being paid to it. And many publishers, there's over 50 publishers now use this on their website, present these kinds of donuts that these logos that we provide with Altmetric. You can click through to them there and get a page, several pages of information around exactly what coverage that article has received. And you can click through then to the press mentions and the blog posts about it and the tweets and so forth. Because the fact is, though you wouldn't know it to look at most journal websites, there is an online conversation going on about scientific literature. It's just very disparate. So what we're trying to do is bring it together and make it accessible to the people who are reading the paper. And we also have ways of not just providing access to what's being said about a particular paper, but also surfacing information about what is being talked, what's getting the most attention at the moment. And that one way that manifests itself actually is that Nature editors use that. So they use Altmetric data to surface what's getting the most attention, not just among the papers they publish, but generically. And then they select from that, and they have a section online and also the print journal called Social Selection, where they use Altmetric data to surface the stuff that's getting most attention, and then to pick those papers and write short summaries about them to explain perhaps why they're seen as so significant. So social media is sometimes seen as part of the problem of misinformation and disinformation in science. I was having a discussion actually just yesterday with a journalist for The Economist, who we were talking about social media data and this kind of thing. I think social media can be a big part of the solution in terms of fostering an open and active debate around scientific results and making this stuff more visible. And I think indeed we need to make it part of the solution. And hopefully Altmetric is one step in that direction. Finally, I also think we need a new kind of scientific paper. I don't have a product to offer you here because we haven't built this. I think Figshare is sort of a step in the right direction there. But if we're going to publish ever more information, we need to find a better format in which to do it. This goes back to the problem I was talking about earlier on in terms of the information deluge. So as I said, I don't have a product to offer here, but I have some characteristics that I think this needs to have. It needs to be machine readable by design, and that's in part because it needs to be built for discovery through read and pull when somebody's searching for things. What work has been done on specifically this question, or specifically this kind of experiment, rather than push, which is when something appears, you push it out to everyone who might be interested. Now, that's just not scalable anymore. And it needs to enable integration across multiple reports. Right? You need to be able to, computationally, machines need to be able to help us bring together relevant reports in similar or the same domain, and hopefully be able to summarize those for us. This is much more like a database than it is like a traditional publication. I don't know exactly what this is going to look like, but I think we need to innovate around this as an industry. Because in the 17th century, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, the scientific journal itself was an innovation. and it still has its place, but it's time for something new that meets the needs of a digital, data-driven, globally networked 21st century kind of science. And publishers are facilitators of scientific knowledge dissemination, notwithstanding some aspects of their reputation there, which I alluded to earlier. We need to make sure that we continue to support the progress of science. Science itself faces a number of, I think, unprecedented challenges, and I've outlined some of them here, that could inhibit future progress. I think already are inhibiting progress. But with sufficient imagination and intelligence, I think publishers can be a big part of the solution, not part of the problem. With that, I'll stop. Thank you very much for your attention. Do you want me to take questions, or do you want to?
We are doing our Q&A.
Okay.
But since you won't be here, good time for a couple of questions. Does anybody have a question for
Peter?
Timo?
Peter Monrost, Cambridge, Europe PubMed Central. Tim and I go back a long way, and I think you've done a lot of great things. But I would state that I think the last year, the publishers have shown themselves to be unresponsive to the needs of the scientific and the wider scholarly community. And I've spent last year fighting the publishers, and I use that word, in Europe over the question of text and data mining. The publishers have not been in the slightest bit constructive. They've tried to make their own pool and so on. So that's a statement. I want to ask you one question. Do you think the time has come for the scholarly publishing industry to be regulated in terms of what it does with things like social networks, access to information and so on, or do we simply continue to, quotes, trust, unquotes, the publishers?
So two things to say quickly about that. First of all, I completely agree with you on text and data mining. I gave a talk just over 2 years ago now to a meeting in Amsterdam of scientific publishers and text and data mining people, where I think it would be fair to say I castigated publishers for not doing more on that front, and was not incredibly popular as a result. I just made the point that I think, you know, so much more could be made of the content that they're generating, so much more value can be derived that actually publishers seek to benefit from it as well. It's not, you know, but publishers are very small c conservative. The people that run many publishing companies are worried about unknown consequences, and I think by definition, when you do something like open up your content to text and data mining, the benefits that come precisely from the fact there are unknown consequences from doing that, like you can't predict all the uses of it. So I completely agree with you on that. Should the publishing industry be regulated? Just sort of, you know, constitutionally, I'm not a person who loves sort of lots of top-down regulation. I think what we need, and what actually does exist increasingly, but I think hasn't existed enough in the past, is lots of competition. Authors and indeed readers need choices, right? And what we need is a competitive environment. I think things like the growth of green open access has helped, because it means that publishers no longer have a perpetual monopoly on a piece of content. It's a time-limited monopoly, usually 6 to 12 months, something like that, in order to recoup their costs and generate a return, which I think is sort of fair enough, actually. But fundamentally, the problems that have been the problems in scientific publishing with regard to it serving science itself have been as a result, I think, of lack of competition. In particular, if you want a particular piece of content, you haven't got any choice but to go to the publisher who's got that particular piece of content. So I wouldn't be in favour of regulation. I'm in favour of as much competition as we can possibly engineer.
You have time for one more? At random?
Hi, I'm Emma Ganley. I'm actually from PLOS Biology, and formerly at Journal of Cell Biology. So I've done a lot of work looking at image manipulation. Yeah. So I'm wondering how we reconcile the need to not be too much of an inhibition to publication as publishers, but be on the lookout for those cases of fraud, which can be only best described as incredibly messy after the fact.
Well, I think, as I said, my sense, but I'm not sure anyone knows this, my sense is that out-and-out fraud is much, much rarer than just this sort of much less conspicuous form of, you know, just sort of dressing up your results so that they show what you want them to show. And you think you're doing the reader a favour, but you might not be. That's the problem. I think there's really two things. There's two principles, right? One is to acknowledge the problem and to talk about it. And I know Journal of Cell Biology has done a lot of work on this, and I've spoken with colleagues at, say, Nature Cell Biology who are also very, very conscious of this. So one is to acknowledge the problem and highlight it, not sort of hide it. The other is make the original data files available, right? And if people want to look at them, they'll look at them. And maybe in many cases they won't, but in principle they're available, right? So if you've done some kind of image manipulation, make the original unadulterated image available, and then people can judge themselves if they want to.
I guess the issue there is that the editors, there's a lot of work to do to get that from the scientists. So then there's still this position for a publisher to be the person who oversees that. So there's this, this pushback against publishers for kind of being a barrier to publication. Then there is a need for some sort of oversight of what's going out there. So I think that's the place where I can't see how we reconcile.
Well, I think two very quick things. One is so there's definitely an issue where publishers and journals don't want to be the ones to implement those kinds of policies most strongly because it turns off authors and they'll go elsewhere. So I do think some kind of group action where we say, look, here's a certain minimum standard that we all sign up to and that we'll all do it because we think it's for the common good. I think the second thing is what we're trying to do at organisations like Digital Science is actually provide the tools and services that make it easy. Like, if you're capturing all the stuff at source in the lab and you've got it there and you can click a button and push it online and it has a DOI, then you're going to object a lot less than if it's days and days of work.
Yeah, really converts.
All right. Okay, I think with that,
thank you.
Thank you, Timo. Round of applause. Okay, just to briefly introduce the next speaker. Briefly, I do tend to wear lots of different t-shirts, and I did my best today to be impartial. This particular one, the message is not important, it was the choice of cover, kind of ties in with the next speaker. The next speaker has a distinguished career as a science publisher, and as far as I'm aware, he's probably the UK's most experienced science publisher that we have, and more importantly, the most experienced open access publisher. Jan and Velterop.
Thank you, Graham. This is work.
Yes.
Good. Yeah. Thank you for inviting me here. It's a pleasure to speak here. I'll probably have double the impact of what I normally have. Two screens. I'm going to talk about the changes that I see in publishing and who does what. And I think that the global south, by which I mean places like Brazil, India, China, are leapfrogging what we do here. Now, I found this statement on the web not long ago, basically saying, yes, we outsource a lot to those countries, but it's never threatened our core business, namely project management and editing. This is from a UK publishing services company. To which I would say, yeah, dream on. Why would that be the case? Why would that be the case? Why would the core business not be threatened? Outsourcing, of course, has been a fact of life in publishing for a very long time. And where would we be without this? Well, it's basically very close to slave labor. It's very cheap and so on. But if you think about it, most of science publishing already takes place in those areas, in these emerging economies. You're maybe not aware of it, but the majority of people working on the articles that you publish are working in places like India or the Philippines. They're not working here in Europe or America. And what will happen, I think, and what's bound to happen is the following. I mean, we used to see computers being made in China, but of course under the brand of IBM or Packard and so on. But of course, not too long ago, the ones that were made in China were then also branded in China. I've taken here Lenovo, but I suppose it's this whole thing could be applied to many areas. It's not just computers. So why is it not happening in science publishing? All the work is being done, or much of the work is being done, and what stops the taking control, so to speak, doing the editorial work, the management work, the marketing work in those countries as well, and a lot cheaper than could be done in Europe or America? Well, might it be the Beale effect? I mean, I've seen these kind of plays on his name, and I think that something like this is going on. There's something that I find I'm very uncomfortable with, is that publishers that come from, say, India, that have an Indian name, are made suspect right from the start, even though they may just be, not quite as slick as the publishers in Europe and America. They may be kind of a little bit more amateurist, but they're honest attempts, I think, to change the game. And there is this list, this Beale list, that classifies these publishers very, very quickly as predatory, which I think is just is just wrong. And then there's another thing: the literature in, say, in this particular case in South America, is not exposed to the degree it should be. It's practically invisible in Google. Why should that be? Is there this bias? Now, science, of course, is a constellation of biases, if you wish, a system of biases. Timo already talked about the publication bias. There's the sample collection bias, or sample bias. There's a reader bias, and there is this bias as well. I don't know that we can ever get away from it, by the way. We have to deal with it, though. But many of these things are just vestiges of an imperial view of the world. And I'm not exaggerating when I say, I think I'm not exaggerating, when the elitism of Europe and America is basically still prevalent when it comes to science. But science is moving out of, not out of, but is extending into other areas as well, into places like South America, like the Far East, and so on. And I think publishing is very logically following it. Although it's not necessarily so visible yet, it is taking place in the background. I give just two examples. One is Hindawi. I'm sure you heard of Hindawi, a publisher in Egypt. And the other one I would like to pay attention to is Cielo, which is not really a publisher, but it's a kind of a publishing approach to a very large degree, paid for, subsidized by the various governments of the countries in which they are active, and that's based in South America. So Hindawi, palatial offices in Cairo somewhere, or near Cairo, and Ahmed Hindawi, the main shareholder, gave this statement not too long ago. We don't have to worry about the financial health of Hindawi. I think this is actually a higher profitability than your usual suspects. There's no reason why Hindawi shouldn't do very well, because in Egypt there are very clever and well-educated people as well, just as there are in Europe or America. The proportion of people who could deal with science in those countries it would be very unlikely if the proportion of people that have the intellectual wherewithal would be much lower than in the West. The other example is Cielo. I'll talk a little bit more about Cielo because it's a bit of an unusual thing. It has very much more similarities with PubMed Central than it has with a publisher. I call it a publishing approach, a way to get the material out. It's open access, and what they basically do, they are a place to deposit the material. They host it and they preserve it. But the things that they do are collections of journals, as they call it, And those collections are typically national collections of countries in South America, but also a few now outside of South America. These are the collections that are in it at the moment, and you see that a few are outside of South America. So it is gradually sort of spreading its wings. Okay, it's still very much the Spanish language area, and that is, of course, been one of their problems, and one of science's problems, that not all science is in English. Not all science publications are in English. And but now they have moved to a system where, yes, it may be in Spanish or Portuguese, but it will also have to be in English in order to be eligible for coverage. If you go to Cielo, you get an article that looks a bit like this. It's open access, and if you then look at the permissions, then you see that it is open access. Unfortunately, it's not always CC BY. It's often CC BY non-commercial, which I have talked to them about. You know, it's difficult because there's all these countries and all the journals involved and so on, and it's a bit of a bugbear still, I think. But anyway, who knows? Maybe this is changing. You can also share your stuff, and if you know, if you come to a website and they say, oh, share this, you see, it's Twitter and others and so on. And so it's Cielo as well, except that they have a few more. Well, you think this is it? No. 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 This is it. A little bit of an embarras du choix, I think, I never knew that there were so many. Are they all covered by AQnowledge?
We'll work on it. If I could get your list later.
I can send you the list. So the journals are not published by Cielo; they're independent entities, and that means that Cielo is the Cielo, the platform, is supported by governments in South America and Spain, Portugal, and South Africa. But they don't cover. They just cover the open access versions of this platform. They don't necessarily cover all the costs of the publishers. I'll give you an example. There is this International Morphology, International Journal of Morphology from Chile, and there is a cost to authors. It's very much the author pay NPC model for that we know from Violence and Say and PLOS as well. Now, currently, there's a lot of interest in South American science for some reason. I think this may have something to do with it. We see in last week in New Scientist, Brazilian Science. Paid attention to from what's her name? Erin McKiernan.
Yes.
From Mexico. Sorry. Also paying attention to South American science, South American repositories here, and so on. They're all doing a lot of work, and it's very. But there is one big elephant in the room, or actually a dinosaur, and I couldn't find a picture of an elephant in the room. and Timo already alluded to this. There is this problem with reading the literature that you need to read, because there's just too much. So these are all the things you can read. You choose from. How do you choose? Is it not too much of a random process where you choose what to read? You can't read it all. There's no way. So on what basis do you make your selection? So this is another one of those biases. I mean, you select probably the things that you recognize in some way. You recognize maybe the author. You recognize the institution where he or she comes from. There is, and it's just random. And what do you come across? What has been referenced, which doesn't necessarily mean it's more significant. It just means that there's an easy way to find the article, and then you read it. There is this embarras du choix that I mentioned earlier. How do you deal with it? I mean, there's no way you can read all all that's there and all that's relevant. Now, I don't believe in filtering. I don't believe in publishing less. It's really not the right answer. You don't want fewer data points. You don't want less knowledge. You want more, but you have to find a way of dealing with it. And that's the trouble. What do we do? Now, if you're an archaeologist, you don't start digging randomly. You take an aerial survey. You look at the field first, and then if you find interesting bits, then that's where you go with your shovel, and that's where you start. Digging. Now we need an analogy of that in science as well. And so an approach that I favor, but it's maybe just one approach, is to extract significant assertions, significant statements from articles that have been published, and maybe further than articles. There's a project underway. It's called Lazarus, raising the knowledge from the dead, I suppose, which aims to identify assertions of scientific significance. There's a little bit of judgment call there, of course, and expose those in the literature. This is based on a PDF reader, Utopia documents, and if you read an article, could be a paywalled article in Utopia documents, and you're online, those statements will be harvested, if you wish. It goes like this: there's a statement, and what we harvest is the statement. This statement was found in that article, DIY. So it's a reference, in a sense, but a reference with kind of a meaning that you could use. Now, I don't know if you see, but there are different colors in there. Green is basically those statements have been found elsewhere already. Blue are the new ones, or the other way around. Again. So this is very interesting because when you start reading your stuff, you will only focus on new bits and the old that's known, that's been published before and so on. So I wonder what that will do to it's one of those unintended consequences that may arise to how you read your literature. So, but the idea is that these statements would be semantically normalized to the degree possible, and then found in other articles and put together in a database provisionally called the Open Knowledge Database, the OK database, and then made available for machine reading and for people to do whatever they want to do with it. Hopefully, coming to this idea of an overview first before they actually start reading and start analyzing in detail what the articles are. So these things could be harvested from the open access literature, of course, because that's the meaning of open access. But they could also actually be crowdsourced from the paywall literature by the method that I just mentioned. Just read your articles in this reader, and there may be more of those in the future. And then these references will be taken out of that article. The significant statements will be taken out. And those by themselves can be used to connect a bit of knowledge here and a bit of knowledge there. What's the shortest path between them, etc., etc. They can be used to reason. They can be used perhaps to create this overview that's necessary to make far more use of the implicit knowledge in the literature than is the case right now. So the analogy I have is if you have a large number of data points, you can create a hologram. And if you shine the right light on it, you get the picture. The nice thing about this approach is, and I know it's only an analogy, of course, but the nice thing is that if you have more data, you get a sharper picture, which is very nice. So instead of reducing the amount of knowledge, you actually want to have more and more and more and get a sharper picture. And then you can home in on some of the detail that you are particularly interested in. So I'd like to finish with a few of my expectations in this regard. I don't call it predictions. I've been told yesterday that perhaps they should be speculations, and maybe they are, but you know, I really expect these things. I expect that there will be outfits outside of Europe and America that will take a lead in these things, that will substantially grow the open access publishing body of knowledge, that will try to comprehensively aggregate the knowledge from all the literature. And simply because it is, there are more people available at a lower price in those countries than they are in Europe and America. I also think that they will take the lead in fundamentally changing peer review practices. Peer review, of course, has always been associated with publishers, but more and more people will question that, and I certainly question that. It's not publishing. You know, the peer review is an academic activity, and it should be and remain an academic activity. And the publishing per se is a technical thing. And if that separation were made, let's face it, peer review is, for many publishers, perhaps even most publishers, the reason that they quote as their raison d'être, their reason of existence, which I think is, you know, was probably true or valid a few hundred years ago. It's not really valid now. I mean, okay, they organize peer review very often, but even that is sometimes questionable. And it's an excuse for the high prices, let's face it. So if publishing should really be taking the material from a researcher and making that into a true archivable, standard kind of publication that can be used and machine readable and all that sort of thing, and give it a DOI. The technical bits, funnily enough, those technical bits have been outsourced to the authors, and the academic bits have been appropriated by publishers. That will change, I think, and I see some beginnings of that changing already. And why is this happening not in Europe and America, but in the global South? Simply because they just have fewer legacy issues that we have. We are being held back enormously by legacies of a technical kind, but also legacies of a cultural kind. The ecosystem of science, as it grew up in Europe and America, is keeping an awful lot of progress slow, and it's impeding a lot of it. And this was it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan, for that's probably the first time I've actually seen you give a talk, but I was expecting something extremely interesting and also entertaining. Any questions? Anybody?
I have a question.
And then,
Oh, there's another one.
My name is Armin Smith from GitHub. I'm interested in two things that you talked today that you talked about in particular. One is this idea of kind of free publishing. So I work in a domain of software development where if you were publishing open source software, the act of publication is free on GitHub. And I think that's interesting to decouple the act of actually getting content out there with the review that is kind of crucial for the some credibility of the research with your peers. My question was actually more about the Lazarus project. I was talking to, I think it was Cameron Nayland at PLOS, about this idea of kind of a dependency management in the literature. So this idea that if you've got all these statements and reliance of these statements on prior knowledge, then what happens if something very early in that tree becomes invalid? And does that sort of raise a sort of flag on all the literature that then goes on and cites that in a positive or negative way? And so there's two things there. Like there isn't, I guess, a positive and negative citation model yet currently, but well, I know there's some work on that. But what are your thoughts on that and sort of dependency management of knowledge and in the future?
it's interesting. One of the things that I'm being told all the time is, well, this can never give you answers. It can never give you answers, and I agree, it doesn't. But what it does, it gives you a hint. It gives you a way of deciding what to start reading and so on. So yes, there will be it will be fuzzy, and there will be these things like older knowledge is then essentially. But the thing is, when we capture these things, we also capture a date stamp. So you can look at more recent stuff and see, and look at only the recent stuff and not the very old stuff, because that may be invalidated by now. So yes, there are issues there, but don't get the impression that I'm saying this gives you answers, because it won't. It will give you strong hints though, and that is an enormously important thing already. If you instead of reading 1,000 articles, you can actually get the essence of what you're after with reading 10 articles, then you save an enormous amount of time and effort and a lot of redundancy in the publications will have been filtered out. So that's what I think is happening here, and that's a very good thing. Is it perfect? No, because perfect doesn't really exist in this realm. So it is a way of coping with. Possible way of coping with the enormous amount of information and growing information that we have. And you had a first your first.
Just a comment really about
what was it?
Just that publishing becoming free in some domains and how that kind of.
Yeah. So I do want to react to that, because my ideal scenario is this: that a scientist finds colleagues in other areas, in other institutions, and so on, who take a look at their papers and then say, well, as a kind of a peer review, I call it peer endorsement. Okay, well, this is publishable. Why don't you publish it? Put my name to it as the person who endorses publication of this. Which doesn't mean it's right or anything, and peer review doesn't really do that anyway. But it means this is good to be published because it adds to the discussion. So, it adds knowledge to the discussion. It is worth publishing. Once that's happened, then of course you can publish it anywhere. You don't have to pay anyone. If you are very good at formatting it all, then you don't need anybody's assistance. You just publish it. Now, if you need that assistance, then you might want to go to a new style publisher who does that for you for a small amount of money, of course. Not money, because people have to do the work. But that is my ideal solution. And if you look at what that could do to the cost of publishing as a whole, probably reduced by a factor of 20, 30, which, when you talk about sort of a 5 billion or 6 billion industry a year, is quite a lot of money, which could perhaps be put back into science.
Okay, I'm just conscious of the time, but
Okay.
okay, thank you again. So I've been conscious of the time and coffee. I've only had 2 cups of coffee for my whole life, but there will be coffee after the next talk. Okay, so leading us up to the end of session 1. The next speaker has a passion for everything that's open. So from the Open Knowledge Foundation, it's Michelle Brook.
Slightly intimidating having a round of applause before I start speaking. So I'm Michelle Brook. I work at a number of different organisations, one of them being the Open Knowledge. Am I not on? Great. So, hello?
Yeah.
Okay, let's try and bring that up a bit. Is that a bit better? Can you hear me at the back? Awesome. So, my name's Michelle Brook. I work at a number of different organisations, including the Open Knowledge Foundation. Recently renamed to Open Knowledge, but it's a little bit controversial and it's still difficult to get it kind of rolling off the tongue properly. So, I'm, as I've been told, it's been said, I'm really kind of quite passionate about open science and open access, and I spend a lot of my time kind of working on these kind of issues. But in the UK, we've won on open access, right? I mean, after all, we've got a large number of mandates come up over the last couple of years. RC UK have insisted that all their funded research has to be available in an unrestricted online fashion. Wellcome Trust equally also talks about trust-funded researchers must select routes that ensure work is available immediately on publication, as well as requiring CC BY licensing on their work. We then move on to HEFKI, where they've also been stating that final peer-reviewed manuscripts must be deposited, and this kind of came up over the last couple of months. I think it was at the end of March that they made this latest statement. Then we look out to Europe, and Horizon 2020 has also recently introduced a mandate talking about the fact that all their articles that are published and paid for by Horizon 2020 must be made open access and available online. And then over the last month, we've also had the Hargreaves legislation come into play. So we've now got copyright exceptions for all non-commercial research. So all research can be text and data mined for non-commercial reasons, although we're still not really quite clear on what actually that might mean. So we've won, right? Well, I don't necessarily agree that we have. To me, it looks a little bit like we're still at some kind of business as usual state. Yes, we've had a few different modifications, we've got a few differences, but it still looks largely like it did a couple of years ago. And what I mean by that? Well, 10 years ago, we were in a situation where the literature was limited to those who had financial resources to access it, where publishing was controlled by a small number of organisations, and the entire system was designed not really for the benefit of academics, but instead for these organisations who were doing the act of publishing. But before I go a little bit further, I just want to kind of reiterate what I actually mean by open access. As has been seen over the last couple of years, the kind of term has been muddied a little bit from the original kind of ideas of it. So if we go back to the kind of Budapest Open Access Declaration, we start kind of, finding and picking apart some of the key words. I'm not going to talk, the 50 shades of open access, green, gold, black, red, platinum, as I've seen various people kind of start referring to it on kind of various mailing lists, but instead talk about a few of the high-level concepts that it kind of really refers to. So hopefully, fairly non-controversially, open access is about literature that's free to read, apart from for the technological limitations of gaining access to the internet itself, which, although here in the UK, in Europe, we tend to be okay, it's not a huge problem. There are a large number of countries out there where, sometimes it can be difficult to find internet for very long, and it can be difficult to start downloading some of those PDFs. So it's actually not quite as low a barrier as perhaps we might necessarily think. Slightly more controversially, or sadly, is talking about CC BY licensing. Now, as I'm sure most people here in the room know, that's kind of basically the equivalent of citation. However, this kind of can often cause problems. And social science communities, for instance, often get a little bit angsty about the idea of not having NC or ND licenses on the work that they're kind of publishing. Probably much more controversially is the idea that we've already heard that kind of publishing academic research to allow publishers to recoup their costs. I don't necessarily agree with that. There is kind of a bunch of evidence that suggests that perhaps these things and kind of embargo periods and reducing these embargo periods doesn't actually have as big an effect as kind of a lot of publishers would necessarily have you believe. And then, for me, not kind of, specifically related to what is open access, but key features of any open access publishing system are two further points. Firstly, cost effectiveness. So this is kind of a really crucial point. A lot of the argument that were made originally around open access were largely kind of claiming that an open access publishing system would be far cheaper to implement than the existing traditional publishing system, where, as again we've heard mentioned, that there is kind of serials crisis, where publishers were raising journal subscription fees kind of dramatically and incredibly quickly, which meant that libraries couldn't afford to pay for a lot of the work, which leads to kind of quite interesting situations. And you've got academics who can't access everything, and that's a problem. So if we've made this argument that, open access is a financial benefit, then we really do want to be seeing a system which is cost effective. And the last point, I think, is actually really crucial and often not mentioned, that it becomes easy to find and to access and to use the work that has been made available. We don't want to kind of create a technological equivalent of displaying the research in the bottom of a locked filing cupboard in a disused lavatory with a sign on the door saying beware of the leopard. It's really much more important to actually make it kind of openly available. And if we don't do that, there isn't really a huge amount of point of making it open access as defined by the other terms. So I don't differentiate so much between green and gold. Instead, I differentiate between open access and bad open access. And what I mean by bad open access is basically the opposite of what I've just said. So we're talking about long embargo periods, non-CC BY licensing, hard to access, find and use work. I'm also talking about kind of the costs to it, so high article processing charges or using excessively hybrid journals. And I think it's fair to say we're much closer to here than we are necessarily to the previous slide. Go back to here. So, I'm sure it's not news to many people in the room, but embargo periods under the RC UK mandate, if you don't have access to funds, research can be embargoed in humanities and social science for up to 24 months. That's 2 years. It's quite a significant length of time. And HEFKI, it's similar. The policy that they've got in place, again, doesn't require this research to be made openly available as kind of straight away. So if we then think about the licensing, this can be a little bit interesting. So again, with HEFKI stuff, the research is allowed to be CC BY NC ND. So research can be put under non-commercial and non-limited licenses. This, again, I'm not criticising HEFKI. It could in creating this mandate. However, it means that we're not really there in terms of kind of achieving open access yet. And then when we look at the journal side of things and how journals deliver open access, they can sometimes be a little bit tricky around these kind of CC BY licensing themselves. So when I talk about publishers there, I mean traditional publishers. They often charge additional funds for work that's made CC BY or equivalent than they do for work that's under more restricted licenses. I don't necessarily know whether I agree with that. It's also interesting that some publishers, I'm not going to mention any names, seem to delight in running slightly misleading surveys with leading questions and then publishing results that show that academics don't want CC BY licensing after all. It's very easy to get any results that you want from, a carefully constructed survey. So we've won. As I said, I don't think so. I really don't think so. But when RC UK put in place their Gold Open Access mandate last year, there were lots of kind of rejoicing from the open access community. People, on the whole, were really quite happy. We've made it, we've achieved it. There were a few people who expressed some concerns. There were some people who felt that it wasn't really necessarily pushing for a system that was going to be cost effective, or kind of really allowing for change in the system that kind of works for academics. And we've had an opportunity recently to kind of start exploring this. So earlier this year, so in March, the Wellcome Trust released an APC dataset, an article processing charge dataset, of everything that they'd paid for in the last year. And a few people saw the opportunity to really kind of start getting to grips and exploring what is the effect of these Gold Open Access mandates, because that is, again, what Wellcome Trust have introduced. And Theo Andrew, who's in the room here somewhere, hello, he came up with a great idea and put it all onto a Google spreadsheet. And from there, we started kind of working on it in a communal fashion to take the 2,000 line items that the Wellcome Trust had released with limited data, including cost, journal, name, a few other bits and pieces, but not a huge amount of information, and to really start enriching it. And so the AQnowledge Foundation Open Access Working Group, Theo, some other people some of whom have decided to remain nameless because of institutions they work for, we all got involved and we started kind of poring over it, enriching this data set, and really starting to explore what was actually kind of contained within that information. First off, an important point to note, in just 1 year, October to September, Wellcome Trust spent £3.88 million on gold open access publishing. And bear in mind that that's just one research fund in just one country. That's quite a large sum of money. I mean, Wellcome Trust are rich, but that's still quite a lot of money. So you then start thinking, if, you know, publishing is really being disrupted, hopefully this is starting to go to, you know, interesting, new, innovative, young publishers, right? It's starting to go to interesting, new people. Well, a cursory glance told us that 74% of papers and 82% of costs were going to hybrid journals. As soon as you start seeing the idea of hybrid journals, you can kind of get, you know, the idea, the impression that it's probably not young, innovative, digital native companies, but instead going back to kind of the same old companies. So who was it who was receiving so much money? Yeah, usual suspects really there. So you've got Elsevier receiving £1 million just over of this money. Wiley Blackwell, 500,000. DOS doing quite well. That's the kind of closest we've got there to a disruptive company, receiving 350,000. OUP and MPG were receiving a couple of £100,000 less. And just for information, I removed MPG, I removed Frontiers, but I think it only increased the amount to about 286,000. I kept it separate because I wanted to explore open access and the kind of hybrid side of things. But, you know, as I said, maybe they're just releasing loads of open access journals and that's what's happening. You know, the old traditional publishers are innovating themselves. As I said, 82% of costs were being paid to hybrid journals. And that's not really surprising when you start looking at some of the kind of figures. So if you look for Elsevier, nearly 1,982,000 of just over 1 million was spent on hybrid journals. And this was kind of journals like Cell, this kind of, you know, the traditional prestigious journals. And what starts becoming really interesting is if you look at the average costs. So the average cost of publishing in a pure open access journal for Elsevier was 2,500, I believe. Yes. So it was more expensive to publish in a pure open access journal with Elsevier than it was to publish in a hybrid journal. And you start seeing this with kind of a couple of the others. And just to say, the only one there that doesn't have a hybrid cost is obviously PLOS. But when you start putting out what those percentage figures look like in terms of the total amount received by each of these companies, it really starts looking quite scary and quite large. And it really doesn't look like there's any of this kind of innovation or interesting things or, you know, disruptive influences taking place within the gold open access market. And why, and just to say, it wasn't just Wellcome Trust. It could be very easy to say that maybe it's just the Wellcome Trust data set. Maybe it's just a factor of biomedical journals. Well, Austrian Science Fund, FWF, released their figures in response to the Wellcome Trust releasing theirs, and you start seeing the same again. So in the bottom table, you see that hybrid open access costs came to €2 million in a total sum of €2.8 million. So again, it's another kind of data point that starts showing us where this is happening. And again, if you look at the journals at the top, it's again these usual suspects, the big publishers, and the ones who are, again, often being kind of receiving money in hybrid journal costs. PLOS, again, do make it in, but dramatically less than any of the others. And I should also say that it isn't just these two science funders. So there's a number of universities who've released their APC data sets, and when you start looking through those, you see the same picture again and again. So you see it with, I'm not going to name all of them, but Cambridge and Queen's Belfast both released their APC data set, and they're both, I believe, on Figshare. You can start kind of taking them apart and exploring them a little bit, and you do start to see these pictures. So again, to me, this doesn't look like disruption in publishing. It looks like there's something going wrong here. And why is it important? I mean, you know, we've got open access, that's fine. But one of the key things is when we have hybrid journals, we're still paying for subscriptions. And subscriptions aren't exactly cheap. So these figures are taken from some work that Tim Gowers did fairly recently. Tim Gowers being a Cambridge mathematician, very passionate about open access, and really keen to try and disrupt the system. He's been pushing very strongly within Cambridge to try and encourage Cambridge to step back from the big deals that publishers force on them. And again, the large sums of money here are kind of, coming into play. So you look at UCL, that's £1.2 million, just over, I think it's 1.3 in total, being spent by one university for 1 year to one publisher. And that same money is being spent, and there's kind of money being spent by other universities to the same content. So to each of these other universities, they're paying largely and broadly for the same content. Again, that to me doesn't necessarily look like kind of this disruption. When I come to spaces like this, I hear all about how kind of the future, how it's all changing, that publishing is changing. I'm not sure yet that we've necessarily got there. I think that we're still in this space here. Sorry, my voice is getting better. I think what we've achieved is open access, if by open access we merely mean freely available literature, after a period of time. So the problem with long embargoes is that it still favours those who are financially privileged in some way. If you can't gain access to the work for 6 months, 12 months, 24 months after it's been published, those who are financially able to pay for work up front still have the advantage over other people who may not come from kind of, quite such privileged institutions, maybe involved in small startups, or maybe an individual sat outside academia who wants to read some papers on something that they find a little bit interesting. I think, personally, that publishers, a lot of the time they do stand in the way of dissemination of research, despite the, and I say publishers, traditional publishers, not kind of open access publishers. But I think that they do stand in the way to a degree of kind of some of this innovation and in terms of kind of this dissemination of research. And I say this because I know that a lot of publishers are involved in lobbying against any of these mandates for open access. And I know that they've encouraged other organisations, such as learned societies, to push back against open access mandates. Learned societies are in a bit of an interesting position when it comes to open access. They've got kind of a dual role. Firstly, they are an organisation set up to support their members, but secondly, they're also professional organisations in many cases, and they often have to keep an eye on their bottom line, and without pressure, they're not going to change and look to change their kind of current business model. So I think, really, we're a long way from where we could be, where we should be, and where kind of necessarily true disruption can take us. I think that we're a long way away from a system where an idea where academic literature is openly, I say openly rather than freely, available for everyone, for the benefit of everyone, in a system that's designed for academics. When we see a lot of the traditional publishers kind of retaining holds over publishing, we don't see interesting new ways of doing things. So we see the continuation of the norm with academic research locked up in PDFs, making it very difficult for content mining purposes. We see large numbers of very complicated landing pages to find research and to kind of search through. And we find it very difficult to find research when it's launched and kind of hidden in many hundreds of small repositories based around the country. It's not kind of where I think we should be. And furthermore, it starts being kind of quite a long way away from an idea of a cost-effective system that isn't taking money from an already struggling HE sector. The higher education sector in the UK, as well as in other countries around the world, is struggling. And if the idea of open access is to achieve something cost-effective, the current system really isn't it. This kind of split model, it makes it kind of a little bit problematic. And do you know something? A lot of people don't really care. Most people I speak to really don't care about open access. The people in this room, the people on Twitter, the people watching this, the people who blog about it, we're the odd ones. Most academics that I speak to, they don't really want to know that much about open access. What they want to do instead is to continue publishing. Their career structure, everything that they're kind of based around is based around kind of the ideas of impact factors. It's based around, they believe either correctly or incorrectly in some cases, that their career structure, their progression, is going to be almost solely reliant upon the impact factors of journals that they publish in. And that, again, doesn't look like disruption, that doesn't look like innovation. And we see funding bodies, such as Wellcome Trust, RCUK, places like that, they aren't making statements that say, our grant award bodies are not going to judge you based on the impact factor of the journal you published in. And that would be really great to see, because until we have that side of things, we're not going to see a huge uptake in terms of where people choose to publish. Academics, it's not kind of, a particularly nice world out there for most academics, and many people are kind of a little bit scared of kind of, really pushing the boat out and sticking their necks out in terms of what they perceive career-wise. And yet there are still more academics. While there are some who think that it's a good thing, it's nice, but they're not going to get involved, large numbers don't really care at all. They don't get involved with the discussions. They ignore libraries who try to reach out to them. And then there's a third set who seem to believe, largely, that it's all part of some broad neoliberal, it's often humanities and social scientists who say stuff like this, broad neoliberal agenda around commercialisation of knowledge. And partly this is our fault, open access advocates' fault. We've sold the idea a lot of the time in terms of kind of saying open access is good for innovation, it's good for making more money from the research. We've often neglected some of the kind of social and moral things around open access, talking about fairer equality, talking about equality of access to information, or talking about the fact that humanities and social science research being made freely and openly available can lead to a more informed citizenry who can get more involved with perhaps social issues. Or that medical research being openly available can make things a little bit better and can allow doctors and patients both to make better decisions about their medical care. And that, I think, is a bit of a problem. I'll also flag one other one. We're pretty useless at explaining NC licensing. A lot of people I speak to think that NC, non-commercial, is basically anything that, that there's this very clear defined line between commercial and non-commercial. But as I'm sure most people in this room know, it's very easy to say what commercial research is. It's not very easy to say what non-commercial research is. And that's something that we really do need to be kind of much, much better at kind of expressing to a wider audience. It's fine, I'll just be quick. This is kind of the important part. So pay attention, then we can all go for coffee. I don't believe we're going to get true disruption in this system until we actually start being much better at telling people who aren't here why this stuff matters. And I'm not going to say, it's not your country needs you, but this issue, this cause does. It needs you, people here, to be thinking about who isn't here, who should be here. You need to be, for instance, I would be very surprised if there were many universities who had clear statements saying that they weren't going to judge career progression based upon the impact factor of journals that their academics were publishing in. Why not? I speak to a lot of deans of research who tell me that the academics in their institution don't care about open access, that they don't hear about open access from the people within their institution. And that's something that we can all do something about. We can go and talk to these people and tell them that we think it's important. We can go and talk to other people who are, publishing work around us and tell them that this is important. I also speak to a lot of librarians who want permission, pretty much, to push back on some of the subscriptions being kind of levied by big publishers, such as Elsevier, such as Wiley. But they don't feel able to without permission from academics, without academics saying, no, this is kind of, the fact that you guys are taking this much money, that publishers are taking this much money from the higher education system is something that's important to me. And so we need to be giving that message to the librarians and saying, no, this is kind of crucial for us. And without that, as I said, I don't think we're really going to get a huge much further down that kind of mandate route. They provide those boundaries and those guidelines. It's now up to using the tools that have been spoken about by kind of Jan and Timo earlier to really kind of start pushing back and start trying to communicate about why this stuff is important. And I'm going to steal the line quickly just to sum up, of course, talk later. Information doesn't want to be free, but we need researchers and academics who really do want it to be free. and then we'll start seeing proper disruption within that system. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. I think certainly in terms of doing your homework, you definitely get 10 out of 10 for that. Okay, time-wise, we're running a couple of minutes late, but I'm sure we can throw in a couple of questions if anybody. There's one right at the very back there. Joe, quick.
And just to say, if anyone has any other questions after, we can chat over coffee. All fine.
Or tea.
Or tea. Or other beverages are available.
Oh, yes.
Not in my life, but.
Yes, my name is Penny Tankamillan from Glasgow. Did you calculate the marginal cost to students of the incremental cost and the full cost of publishing? I did it, just thinking through, for an average English university, the bump in fees was $3,000 per student, yeah? In the last round?
Wasn't it 6,000 per student in the last round? Because I think it went from about it's 3,500-ish up to 9,000 as being the cap, but everyone approached the cap, so I think the average is about 9,000 to 7,000.
Well, if you just did the undergraduates, what we have the spectacle of is a 5% increase in the profits taken by these 4 publishers in the UK, based on the borrowing of, I don't know, 20,000 kids, 18-year-olds, are borrowing an additional £2,000 or £3,000 a year to feed the machine. Now, I know that nobody can do anything to make anybody do anything about it. There is no constituency. I myself have written on this in the social science, where it's worse. But somehow we have to find a constituency, and I honestly don't think academics are the constituency. I think it has to be who's actually paying for this stuff. I'm sorry, that was a speech rather than a
No, I completely agree with you. And in fact, in one of the blog posts that I wrote, I did actually do some basic calculations around how many students it was, and I can't remember the exact figure, but it was something in the ballpark of what you pointed out there. I completely agree. I think personally it's abominable that we have seen this increase in tuition fees. The whole higher education sector is in an interesting state at the moment. We've seen it kind of becoming increasingly commercialised, talks and, again, conversations around innovation and blah, 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 and, talking about how we can commercialise knowledge. And this is part of the reason I think that the open access movement has brought into those ideas and that language. It's politically expedient, even if it's not necessarily going to get everybody on board. So no, I completely agree that there are huge problems, and I think that there are a large number of kind of really great groups, such as the Open Access Button, which are really focusing, and Spark do a lot, where they focus very much on talking to students about some of these issues. I really hope that they start picking up some of these figures and really start using the student networks that they've got to kind of tell them this message. But I would say that I don't think it is just the students who do need to change, who need to be aware of it. I tend to find one of 2 groups are really keen on open access. It's either the students coming in, or it's the older professors who've already made their careers, again, as was being alluded to earlier. One of the big kind of problem areas, I think, are very much that kind of middle career academic, who is still trying to get, as far enough up the career ladder, or perhaps those who are kind of in their late couple of postdocs who are trying to get tenure in some way.
Okay, I think time-wise, let's try and keep things on track. We are about 6.5-ish minutes over the moment, so should we regroup at half past as planned? Okay, thank you, Michelle.
Hang on. That's the wrong side.
Right, my friend? Listen, ready for
What's going on?
That's great.